This is the abandoned Red Hook grain terminal in Brooklyn, New York. Constructed in 1922 to serve the New York State Canal System, it's now in disuse, waiting for that inevitable day that developers either convert the structure into something stylish or demolish it altogether. Believe it or not, the Red Hook grain terminal stands against all odds, as many others like it have been lost to fires, real estate development, or simple neglect. Although exact numbers are unknown, historians speculate that in the industry's prime, these silos and elevators dotted the city in the hundreds. Yet now, only a handful remain. So join us as we discover the history of New York's lost grain elevators. I'm your host Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. To understand how New York ended up with these towering silos, we should take a moment to appreciate how grain has been crucial to civilizations for the better part of recorded history. In fact, even in prehistoric times, humans were so reliant on this as a food source that they recognized the need to store a surplus of grain. Evidence of early grain storage techniques includes using simple pits, natural rock formations, or underground chambers to protect the grain from moisture, pests, and spoilage. The ancient Egyptians developed granaries, large structures specifically designed for grain storage. These granaries were often elevated to protect against flooding and pests, and they used materials such as mud bricks or stone construction to secure storage areas. In ancient Mesopotamia, civilizations like the Babylonians built sophisticated granaries. They employed techniques such as raised platforms, ventilation systems, and sealing mechanisms to preserve grain quality. During the Neolithic period, the Chinese developed clay pottery vessels, such as pots and jars, which were used to store and protect grains. Some pottery containers had specialized features like tight-fitting lids or sealed openings. Perhaps more recognizable to us would be the warehouses that the ancient Greeks and Romans built to store grains in bulk. These structures often had raised floors, ventilation systems, and pest control measures. Then, by the Middle Ages, granaries became common in European villages and towns. Wooden structures, such as barns or specialized granary buildings, were used for grain storage. Additionally, underground cellars or pits were employed for longer-term grain preservation. The beauty of these underground locations in Europe was that they were easy to make, affordable, and kept a constant temperature year-round to avoid spoilage. They generally housed other food alongside the grain, but had one major fault: infestation. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, America took center stage, as new technologies such as the Erie Canal or steam trains enabled producers to rapidly transport their products to central wholesalers, transforming grain storage altogether. These wholesalers served urban markets, hence keeping the product closer to the customer made a lot of sense. Accordingly, the first significant grain storage centers in the United States were established in regions where agriculture thrived and grain production was abundant, with Chicago serving as the industry leader, a fact that would later implicate New York directly. You see, in the mid-19th century, Chicago became a vital grain storage and trade center. The city's strategic location near the Great Lakes and the convergence of substantial railroads facilitated the transportation and distribution of grain. Until burning down in the Great Chicago Fire, Chicago's first grain elevators were unprecedented, so much so that they served as a hallmark of the city. This benchmark for grain storage would be critical, and New York would rapidly follow suit. Long story short, because of its strategic location in the Midwest, Chicago all but ran New York in the grain trade. We covered this in depth in another video, which you should watch after this, just to appreciate how powerful the industry became. But for context, I'd like to offer you a few key points. You see, New York traders studied the quantity of grain traded out of Chicago. They wanted to replicate the elevators built to house the product, which at the time were considered some of America's first skyscrapers. They also noted that financial contributions by grain merchants were used to make some of Chicago's most iconic landmarks. Benjamin Marshall contributed to the Art Institute, Marshall Field donated to the Field Museum, Max Adler played a crucial role in founding the Adler Planetarium, and John G. Shedd helped establish the Shedd Aquarium. Hence, concluding the bit about Chicago here, many of those buildings were featured at the World's Columbian Exposition, propelling Chicago into a modern image, an image in part bought by cash from grain. On the surface level, these were terrific gestures, but I don't want to mislead you. Many of the businessmen were outright evil when it came to manipulating the market by hoarding grain to increase the price artificially. When the grain went bad, the elevators would mysteriously burn down, and an insurance claim was made. So, of course, with that kind of action on the table, New York wanted in, and logistically speaking, they had many advantages. With its location on the East Coast, New York City served as a vital port for international trade. It had access to the Atlantic Ocean and was a gateway for importing and exporting goods. So any Chicago merchants wanting to make deals abroad needed to go via New York. While the Midwest was a significant grain-producing region, other parts of the country, including the eastern states, also contributed to domestic grain production. Having grain elevators in New York City enabled the storage and distribution of domestically produced grains within the region. It provided a central hub for local consumption, which was growing massively. That's right, the city's population and industrial growth created a substantial demand for grain as raw materials in bakeries, breweries, distilleries, and other food-related industries. Grain elevators in New York supported the local processing and manufacturing sectors by ensuring a steady supply. By the late 19th century, New York City had a massive demand for grain, and the logistics required to keep the supply moving were awe-inspiring. Grain, such as wheat, corn, or soybeans, would be cultivated and harvested on farms in the Midwest, including states like Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, and Ohio. Farmers would harvest the grain from their fields and transport it to on-farm storage facilities, such as grain bins or silos, the remains of which you can undoubtedly admire during your next road trip across the Midwest. From there, farmers would use trucks, farm wagons, or other means of transportation to deliver their grain to these nearby grain handling facilities, where the product would be unloaded and stored in large bins or silos. These local storage centers were typically near railroad facilities and acted as central collecting points for the grain from local farmers. The grain stored at local elevators would be loaded onto rail cars for transportation to larger grain terminals in Chicago, where it could be held in more extensive storage and handling facilities to undergo receiving, storing, and processing. From Chicago, the grain would be loaded onto transfer rail cars or transferred to barges or ships for transportation to the eastern markets, including New York City. Once in New York, the grain would arrive at terminals and elevators near the port areas, such as Brooklyn or Staten Island. These terminals would handle the transshipment, storage, and distribution of the grain within the city or for further export to international markets. And it was around this point that grain elevators began appearing all over the riverfront. Everyone wanted in on the action. Piers 6 and 8 were interesting examples of the last and largest grain elevator built by a railroad in the port of New York. Its 2 million bushel capacity and 1.2 million bushel elevator on the adjacent Pier 8 to the north, completed about 14 years earlier, gave the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad the most extensive storage facility in the port capable of loading ships and barges. The West Shore Railroad, a subsidiary of the New York Central, operated both elevators at its large waterfront terminal in Weehawken and West New York. Although the Pier 7 structure is now demolished, some elements on site remain intact, such as the foundation. This is typical for terminals of its type, which were built between 1870 and 1900, a necessity in capturing the port's once immense grain traffic from the Erie Canal. The slightly later construction of the Pier 7 elevator was the New York Central's unsuccessful response to changes in North American grain shipping patterns, which eroded the Port of New York's traffic share after 1890. Locating the remains of this pier was not easy, but if you have a look at this photo of its abandoned ruins in 1968, you'll notice 2 lone apartment buildings in the background. Fast forward to 2023, and we can see one of the 2 buildings on the skyline right behind this modern apartment complex. Upon closer inspection, and from another angle, the images match. Another fascinating observation is that the concrete pilings for the larger structure remain. Still, you can see the wooden pier has entirely disappeared in the last few decades. This is how the 19th century legacy fades. Perhaps most iconic is the Red Hook Grain Terminal, formerly known as the Port of New York Grain Terminal. This rustic example of urban decay was constructed in the early 1920s in the Red Hook neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. The massive concrete structure served as a grain elevator and storage facility. The terminal was strategically located on the waterfront, allowing easy access for incoming grain shipments. During its early years, the terminal played a crucial role in the grain trade, particularly for wheat imports from Canada. It boasted state-of-the-art equipment for unloading grain from ships, elevating it to the top of the building and storing it in large silos. The grain could then be further processed, graded, and distributed to local markets or transferred to other transportation modes for onward shipment. The Port of New York grain terminal thrived during the early mid-20th century, benefiting from the vibrant grain trade in New York City and the surrounding region. It contributed to the city's status as a primary grain handling and distribution hub, supporting the growing population and industries that relied on grain-based products. However, the fortunes of the Port of New York grain terminal began to decline in the later half of the 20th century, when several factors led to its downfall. This story represents a more collective trend applicable to nearby structures, like the Bush Terminal grain elevator in Sunset Park and the South Brooklyn Terminal. First, there were shifts in grain transportation, containerization, and the rise of more modern grain handling facilities in other locations led to a decline in the demand for the terminal's service. The terminal struggled to adapt to these changing trends and relied on outdated infrastructure and equipment. Then, just when things couldn't get more complicated, urban redevelopment and industrial decline made an impact. Like many other industrial areas in New York City, the Red Hook neighborhood experienced urban decline and faced challenges related to deindustrialization. The area underwent significant redevelopment, repurposing former industrial sites for other uses. The Port of New York grain terminal was not immune to these changes, and its location became less favorable for continued grain handling operations. Over time, the terminal's aging infrastructure and maintenance issues became increasingly problematic. The cost of maintaining and repairing the large concrete structure became financially burdensome. Perhaps reminiscent of the Chicago grain elevators I mentioned earlier, in 1965, a fire damaged a significant portion of the terminal, leading to its closure. Efforts to revive the terminal and find new uses were ultimately unsuccessful. Today, the Port of New York grain terminal is a historic landmark, a reminder of the city's once thriving grain trade industry. While it no longer serves its original purpose, it highlights the changing dynamics of the grain industry, urban development, and the challenges older infrastructure face in a rapidly evolving world. The list goes on from there, as is evidenced by the many abandoned docks and lots along the various banks of Brooklyn. And although these structures have now been lost forever, you can get a feel for how they may have looked by visiting Buffalo, New York. Buffalo served as an essential link between Chicago and New York for the grain trade due to several key factors. For starters, there was the geographic location. The city is situated on the eastern end of Lake Erie and the western terminus of the Erie Canal. This location allowed for the efficient transportation of grain from the Midwest to the East Coast. And since there was a robust port infrastructure, the city invested in storage for grain. According to yheritage.org, the Watson elevator was the flagship of the Buffalo grain elevators. It was built in 1862 and occupied a triangular island at the juncture of the Buffalo River and the city ship canal. The famous central wharf is visible in the distance at the left. At the time of this photo, there were more than 70 grain forwarders in Buffalo, all with offices in the central wharf. The structure measured 176 feet to the ridge and had an observation deck, providing waterfront views over 100 feet higher than Buffalo's lighthouses. The smokestack for the steam engine of the Watson was contained within the body of the building, with the entire edifice supported on timber pilings. The building burnt down in 1907. From there, the site was excavated for a turning basin in 1912, and today, nothing remains. Finally, there was the Bennett elevator from 1863, at a time when European architecture was still fresh on everyone's mind. In many ways, this is one of my favorite of the lost New York grain terminals, as on some level, the grain elevators from the 19th century recalled the medieval architecture of Europe. For example, if you look downstream from the Michigan Street Bridge in Buffalo as late as 1895, you might mistake the place for a Baltic port. In the modern day, grain is still sent to New York from the Midwest via rail. Truck transportation has added new players to the mix, and in rare instances, barges still deliver loads. These days, Canadians are the primary producers, pushing grain via America's canals. The biggest transformation is that massive shipments now arrive from international suppliers from abroad, but everything is still stored in grain elevators, just the modern equivalent. In other words, our needs have remained the same, as have many of the methods of delivery to a certain extent, but the architectural legacy of this industry is rapidly disappearing, as the wooden 19th century terminals have all burnt down, as have most from the 20th century. And those remaining will probably collapse under their own weight, if not by the wrecking ball, much sooner. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.